So another issue with pesticide use is that you can actually create new pests. So when you eliminate something in an ecosystem, it kind of leaves a niche for a different organism to come in. And so you end up with new pests that you didn't have before. And so here's an example of this red scale on lemon. Um, and speaking of the ecosystem, and you're looking at the food chain, if you want to call it a chain, you also have issues with bioaccumulation and magnification. So accumulation is the buildup within an organism. So over time, as you're being exposed to this toxin, it's going to build up to higher and higher levels over time. However, biomagnification is actually the increase in the chemical or the contaminant levels as you go up in the trophic levels. So the higher up the food chain you are, um, the more the higher the levels of the contaminant are, which is the reason why you should be careful about how much tuna you eat, because tuna are at the top of the food chain in the ocean, and they tend to be pretty high in mercury. So another example of biomagnification, this is the classic one. Again, here we are back at DDT. I'm not even going to try and, um, say what DDT stands for, because I'm no chemist. But, DDT was in the water after they sprayed it for mosquitoes. And, it's pretty small, like 3 parts per thousand. And then the zooplankton uh, that's in the water absorbed it, and their levels were increasing. And then these fish that ate the zooplankton, um, those they were found in higher concentrations. And then in these larger fish that then ate the small minnows, there's in 2 parts per million. And finally, in these ospreys at the very top of the food chain, you end up with 25 parts per million. And so that DDT actually ended up with their eggs being really soft. So when they went to nest, hatch them, and they sat on their eggs, the eggs actually ended up being crushed. So you have a decrease in the population. Another issue that can happen with pesticides is that they don't stay where you put them. So even though you want to have them on your plants and you want it to go, settle out, I spray it in the air, it settles out onto my crop, and the pest gets a hold of it and bleh, is dead. Well, what can actually happen is through runoff and leaching, um, right? Those pesticides can actually get into systems that are not targeted. Um, Human health, and when we talk about toxicity, we will talk about this more, but there are definitely both short-term and long-term effects of pesticides on human health. So if you're handling food with pesticide residue, you can have anywhere from a mild to a severe case of toxicity. Um, Nausea, vomiting, headaches, and then in severe cases, it can actually damage the nervous system. Whereas in long-term effects, cancer, sterility, miscarriages, birth defect, reduced immune system. So all kinds of things that are linked to long-term exposure to pesticides. I mean, look at this guy. Look what he's wearing to spray, and then people eat that. So there are lots of laws that control the pesticide use. And so here's a list of a few. I don't think that you really need to know any of these per se. Just just that the general idea is to try and control what pesticides are used and in what amount. And so the one that you should know, though, is the Stockholm Prevention Convention. Sorry, the Stockholm Convention to prevent the use of persistent organic pollutants, like I said before, a POP. And so the big one was DDT. Um, the issue with this is that some companies are actually still making these pesticides, and while you cannot use them in the United States, they export them to countries that are not, that are not part of this convention. And so those countries are countries that we can buy our produce from. So we sell the pesticide, the country uses the pesticide, and then you buy the food with the pesticide on it. Some alternatives to pesticides. So this right here is actually a Japanese beetle bag, and so we can put hormones or pheromones to attract the pest insects, and they kind of hit this plastic piece and fall into the bag, and so um, you can actually lure pests into traps. And another way is reproductive controls. So you could actually sterilize the members. This is being done in Florida with a genetically modified mosquito. They're actually putting out sterile male mosquitoes into the population in Florida through GMO, GMOs or genetic modification. We'll talk about genetic modification in a little bit. So other genetic controls that we can talk about are through Bt toxin. So we reduce the use of pesticide by just inserting a gene of this Bt. It's usually in corn, Bt corn. So Bt is the name of the sorry, the word isn't coming to me, the bacteria, and the bacteria produce this protein that is toxic to these caterpillars. Caterpillars eat the plant, and it messes with their digestive system, and they end up dying just from eating the crop that we're trying to save. And so the problem there is that it could actually affect non-target species. And so there's some research happening that this Bt corn might actually be affecting the monarch butterflies. Another way to reduce pests is actually to quarantine any kind of plant or animal material. Um, so to try and reduce any kind of invasive infestation. And another one is irradiating food. So actually using radioactive material to kill any microorganisms. And so it's actually predominantly used on meats and obviously is controversial. Cultivation methods. So right here you see some crop rotation, and by rotating your crops, you can reduce the pests. So if I have something that loves these root vegetables, the next year I plant root vegetables here, and I have legumes here, and those pest insects actually aren't going to bother the legumes. So by rotating your crops, you can reduce the amount of affected how effective your pests are. But other things are interplanting and proper timing of planting and fertilizing, looking at breeding cycles. And so biological controls are that organisms that we release to take, try and control the pest organisms, and that can have a pretty large effect on the ecosystem if you're not careful, because it could attack unintended hosts. So that's dangerous, but it has been successful in the past. And so, why is it dangerous? Well, they can become pests themselves. So, in Australia, they release these cane toads, and now there's a cane toad problem. Um, no one can predict the effects of what the introduced species is going to have on the ecosystem because you're not able to know all of the different arms of the food web and ecosystem interactions. Um, it also may have non-target effects. So even though you might release cactus moths to reduce an invasive or perhaps pest cactus, it's now has migrated into Florida and is eating the cactus in Florida, which is actually endangered. Um, and so removing a biocontrol agent is much harder than just stopping using pesticides. So, it needs to be very carefully planned and executed and tested.